Hi, I'm Dr. Evan Matthews. I'm here today to talk to you about exercising in hot and cold environments and some of the mechanisms that allow us to do this and what happens if things go too far. So this first section is going to be just kind of an overview of this, and then we'll get into hot environments and then cold environments in sections 2 and 3. So humans are what we call homeotherms. This means that we maintain a constant core body temperature. Alright, so in order to do this, we need to balance heat loss and heat gain. This 4-degree difference, the ideal thermal gradient that allows some heat to escape the body but not too much heat, so our bodies are able to maintain this 37 degrees Celsius that we need to. Alright, so what happens if our body temperatures don't maintain that? So if we go too high, specifically for most people, if we go above 45 degrees Celsius, you're going to hit a point in time where our bodies are essentially going to start to cook themselves. All right, so the proteins are going to get destroyed, some of the enzymes will stop working, and this will eventually lead to death. It's important to note that this threshold, some people will hit it before 45 degrees Celsius. All right, so on the other end of the extreme, if our core temperature goes below 34 degrees Celsius, it's going to slow metabolism to a point where things start to get very sluggish, people can lose consciousness, and arrhythmias can happen. So cardiac arrhythmias, in other words, an irregular heartbeat that can be deadly as well. And while I just mentioned that a 4 degrees Celsius thermal gradient is ideal, it can go much more extreme than this. And for instance, in cold environments, it's definitely possible to have up to a 20 degrees Celsius difference between our core and our skin temperature. And this is going to start to require our body to do a lot of things in order to prevent heat illness and injury. The body uses the hypothalamus, which is deep within the brain, in order to control body temperature. So if you look at this diagram here, it's that little red part that just tilted away from us. So as it comes back around, you can see where that hypothalamus is. And so essentially the body is going to send neural signals to the hypothalamus from the core of the body and the periphery, so the skin, in order to let the hypothalamus know what our body temperature is. And then from that, it's going to cause reactions that will regulate our temperature to bring it up or to lower it if necessary. Let's talk about what happens with a fever for a moment. I know this isn't an exercise example, but a lot of the mechanisms are the same, and it's a nice way of sort of understanding this. So the hypothalamus has this set point at where it's going to try to maintain body temperature, which you can see here is this gray line. All right, this gray line again is the hypothalamus set point, and our body temperature is going to oscillate around that set point. So basically increase the temperature to get above the set point, then we lower the temperature to get below the set point, and the goal is to be at the set point, but our bodies aren't quite that refined, and so again you're always going to have this oscillating pattern because you essentially have like a negative feedback happening here. All right, and so when we get a fever, that's because there's some sort of bacteria or virus in the body that's releasing pyrogens into the system, and the hypothalamus is going to see this, and it's going to raise its set point. All right, so here is the onset of fever, and you can see that the gray line, which is the set point, goes much higher really quickly. And there's a period of time here where we have these gray hash marks representing when we are below the set point. Okay, so our body temperature, the red line, is below the set point, which is this gray line, causing our body to perceive ourselves as being too cold. And when we get too cold, what happens? We shiver, our skin constricts or vasoconstricts to prevent blood to go to the skin, which would cause heat loss, and you're going to perceive that as being cold. So when you get a fever and you get the chills and you're shivering a lot, that's what's happening. That's the fever starting, and our body thinks it's colder than it should be, and so you get all these symptoms that's going to raise our body temperature up until you eventually oscillate around this new set point. This is the period of fever. So again, the difference between our normal body temperature and the new temperature is the fever itself. Once the fever breaks, so whether it succeeded in killing off the bacteria and viruses or not, eventually the fever is probably going to come back down. And so when the fever breaks, the set point is also going to come back down to the normal set point. When this happens, our body temperature is now above the set point, which is going to be perceived as us being too hot. So this is when you've had a fever and you wake up in the middle of the night and you're sweaty and your sheets are drenched, right? This is what's happening. So our bodies start to sweat to cool us down. It vasodilates the skin in order to try to get more blood flow to the skin. And again, eventually our body temperature will come back down and oscillate around this new set point, which is a sort of resting level set point. And so when you get the chills, that was just your hypothalamus increasing its set point. And when you get the sweats, that's your hypothalamus coming back down to its normal set point. So that's the fever breaking. And so, again, this is just an example of how the hypothalamus controls the body temperature. But you can see how this could happen with exercise. And the major difference with exercise is there's no change in this set point. The set point stays the same the whole time. We just have this constant heat being produced, which is going to put the temperature above the temperature that the set point is at, causing us to sweat. And that's why we sweat a lot when we exercise. When we exercise, again, we typically get hot and we start to sweat. And one of the things that's going to happen is our body is going to dilate the skin, sending more blood to the skin, and it's going to take heat with it. So heat comes from the core of our body out to the shell of our body, which is where our skin is, and that's going to dissipate a lot of heat to the environment. So it's important to measure both the skin temperature as well as the core temperature when trying to get an idea of what the body is seeing, because it does have sensory neurons both in the skin and in the core that are going to send the signal back to the hypothalamus. All right, so how do we measure skin temperature? With different probes like this. So you can see the end of this probe, this little white piece, is actually a skin temperature probe. And so you would just tape this on various locations of the skin. Typically it's going to be these 7 locations here, but it varies depending on who is doing the measurement in the lab and how that lab particularly does it. But essentially you would need to get lots of these skin probes on the body and get an sort of average skin body temperature. The reason for this is different sites. For instance, the forehead is going to be a slightly different temperature than the chest. The chest is probably going to be a much higher temperature. Likewise, the calf of the individual is probably going to be a little bit lower than maybe the forehead was. And so all these different skin temperature sites are going to have different values. And so you need to do some sort of average, whether it's an exact average like what's being displayed here, or some sort of weighted average on which one is more important. You need to do something like that in order to figure out the sort of average skin temperature that the hypothalamus is seeing. So how do we measure core body temperature? The main and the gold standard way of doing it is through rectal temperature, and so this is an example of a rectal thermometer probe, and so this would be inserted into the rectum in order to measure core temperature that way. Some other ways of doing it would be through the ear, so measuring tympanic temperature, but the issues with that is it is exposed to the outside, which means it's going to have a little more fluctuation based on the environmental temperature. Another way of doing it is esophageal temperature, which would essentially be taking a probe similar to this and inserting it through the nose and down the throat in order to measure the temperature inside the throat. Other than the obvious sort of gagging while this is going down your throat, the other issue with esophageal temperature is if you drink water or anything like that, it's going to change the temperature drastically inside your throat, and so that's going to throw off the measurement. One more way that we can measure core temperature, and this is more of a field type measurement where these other ones are more lab measurements, is to use an ingestible pill that actually has a temperature probe inside of it. And so the issue with this would be, so it's easy, right? So you swallow it goes through your digestive system, and it sends a signal out to a machine as to what the temperature is. But where it is inside your digestive tract is going to change the temperature, and so you can maybe wait a period of time in order to hope it would be in the stomach or in the small intestine or wherever. But everybody's digestion is a little different, so where exactly it is in the digestive tract at any point in time is something we don't typically know. It's going to give some error to the measurement as well. So again, the gold standard for this would be the rectal temperature, which is what is being displayed here. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how to measure skin and core temperature, scan this QR code here, or you can type in this link and it'll take you to a video that explains how to do these measurements. So the body is going to get heat from either the environment or from within, and a lot of the heat is going to come from within, so our bodies produce a lot of heat. we have both a voluntary mechanism as well as multiple involuntary mechanisms for producing body heat. So the voluntary mechanism is essentially exercise or physical activity in order to heat up our bodies. So our bodies are very inefficient. We're going to produce somewhere between 60 and 80% of our energy is going to be turned into heat when we are moving and active. Our involuntary methods here, shivering would be the most obvious one that most people have experienced at some point in time. So all this is little tiny muscle contractions similar to what you would experience with exercise, and so it's going to produce a lot of heat the same way exercise does. And in fact, shivering can produce almost 5 times the body heat that just sitting resting would do. And so it is a very effective method for raising body temperature when we are too cold. A non-shivering thermogenesis mechanism would be to use hormones in order to increase our metabolism. All right, so the primary hormones we're talking about are thyroxine, which is released from the thyroid gland, and different catecholamines, particularly the ones related to the sympathetic nervous system, so norepinephrine and epinephrine. These are both going to increase metabolism, and again, our bodies are very inefficient, and so a lot of that energy is simply going to turn into heat and heat up our bodies. And so these are ways our bodies produce heat if we're too cold, or if we're just exercising, whether we're cold or not, we're going to produce a lot of heat. And so our bodies then have to deal with that and regulate these in some way. Our bodies also have the ability to experience heat transfer. So all this means is to give heat to the environment around us or take in heat from the environment around us. So this can be either way. All right? So our bodies can heat up more because the environment's, for instance, on a hot day, the environment's going to make us feel hot. But on a cold day, we can also give heat to the environment, and so we're going to dissipate heat away from our bodies this way. And so we have 4 main mechanisms for heat transfer: radiation, conduction, convection, and then evaporation, which will be on the next slide or two. So radiation is essentially our bodies giving off heat through heat waves. All right, so this is energy that we can't see. So if we look at this example here, this is the regular image of this individual, and then when we look through a thermal infrared sensor, we can see the actual heat in the body, and this is heat that's coming off of the body through radiation. All right, so our bodies can also gain heat from our environment through radiation. So if you think about sunlight, that's radiation that is heating our bodies up. And so radiation is where we are going to lose about 60% of our heat at rest during normal temperate environments, but this is also where we're going to take in a lot of heat from our environment, again thinking about the sun and the radiant heat coming off of the sun. The next way that our bodies can transfer heat is through conduction, and this is when our bodies come directly into contact with some sort of solid object. All right, so if we have a hot object coming in contact with our skin, it's going to transfer heat into our body, and it's going to raise our body temperature. So think about sitting on like a bench inside of a sauna, or if you're outside in the on like bleachers, and the bleachers have been in the sun all day, and the temperature of the metal bleachers is really hot, and you sit on it, it kind of burns your skin a little bit. That is conduction happening. We can also lose heat if our bodies touch a cold object. So think about maybe like an ice pack or something touching your skin. A lot of our body heat will then go into that cold object, leaving our body and heating up that object. So both of these, whether it's coming into our body or leaving our body, these are conduction. The next method of heat transfer I want to discuss is convection. Convection is very similar to conduction, with the difference being conduction was a solid object touching your body. Convection is either gas or liquid touching your body. And so if we look at this image right here, this is heat coming off of a person's hand, warming up the air around it, and you can see that that air is now moving more, and that this is the gas is more excited. It's hotter than it was before. That's convection. So you can also think about this in an applied standpoint. So if you go outside on a cold day and the wind is blowing and you get a chill, that wind is taking heat away from your body using convection. All right, so the other method would be through liquid. And so if you think about if you've ever gone into an ice bath, you're surrounded in this cold water that's directly contacting your skin, and it's taking a lot of heat away from your body. Again, that is convection. If we look at this image up here, there you can also see an example of convection here. So notice his hand is in a bag, and if we look over here, we can see his hand because we're looking through a thermal lens, allowing us to see the hand and the arm behind the bag. If you look closely to the air around his hand that's inside the bag, it's been increased, and its temperature is increased, and so it's got this sort of bluish hint. That bluish color, again, is us seeing temperature here, and that's actually our body using convection to heat up the air around his hand. So again, all these are examples of convection. The last way that our bodies can transfer heat is through evaporation. So what exactly is evaporation? Evaporation is a liquid turning into a gas, so it's changing its state of matter. And so if we look over here at this diagram, we have a glass of water here, and the water that's at the very top of the glass is going to be in contact with the air. So these water molecules are constantly bumping up against each other and moving around, similar to what's seen here in this image of essentially gas, but it's similar in liquid. And as they bump up against each other, molecules are gaining or losing energy to each other. Right? And so if one molecule gets enough energy, it's going to be able to escape the liquid form and turn into a gas molecule. So basically it turns into water vapor. And so that water vapor is then going to float away, and it's going to take all that energy with it. So again, it only turned into water vapor because it took the energy from its neighboring water molecules and becomes a gas. So as that gas floats away, again, it takes all that energy with it, and so it's taking a lot of heat with it. And so this is how evaporation works and why it's so efficient. It's because we have this liquid on our skin, and it's slowly gaining energy, taking the energy from our skin, all right, and as it gets enough energy to turn into a gas, it's going to float away and take all that energy with it. And so that energy, again, is heat. So we can lose a lot of heat this way. And so if you're talking about exercise, 80% of the heat we lose during exercise normally is lost through this means, so through evaporation of sweat. And so evaporation, again, is a very effective means for reducing body temperature. Evaporation can be affected by lots of things as well. So the temperature and the relative humidity of the environment around you is going to affect your ability to evaporate sweat. All right, so typically a hotter day is going to evaporate the water a little bit faster, but a more humid day is going to prevent evaporation. The reason why humidity is going to prevent evaporation is because humidity is how much water is in the air, and at some point in time the air has 100% humidity, and that means it's holding 100% of the water vapors it can, and so it can't take anymore. So the closer the humidity is to 100% means the closer the air around our bodies is to holding as much water as it can, and so it becomes progressively harder and harder and harder for our skin's liquids to evaporate into the air around us. And so that's going to decrease our ability to evaporate sweat, and it's going to decrease our ability to use sweat as a method for heat transfer to the environment. All right, so some other things that are going to affect it. So convective wind currents are going to bring more air past the liquid, the sweat on our skin, helping it to evaporate. And then also the amount of skin that's exposed. So if you have more skin exposed, that means more sites can evaporate liquid. If you have less skin exposed, it means you're going to be sort of holding that liquid against your skin and preventing it from evaporating. With each milliliter of sweat that evaporates from our body, we're going to lose 0.58, so about a half a kilocalorie of energy to the environment. So that's quite a bit of energy leaving with every single milliliter of sweat that comes off our bodies. And so if we sweat off a liter and that all that sweat evaporates, that's 580 kilocalories of energy that's been dissipated to the environment. And so again, this is the most effective means of heat loss during exercise, but even during rest, we don't perceive ourselves as sweating when we're just going through our normal daily routine, but we're always sweating a little bit. So about 25% of our heat loss at rest is still going to happen through evaporation. Most of the rest of the heat loss during rest, again, is going to happen through radiation. So continuing to talk about skin and how it's so crucial to our body's ability to thermoregulate, the skin can both vasoconstrict and vasodilate the vessels inside of it. And so both of these are going to happen with the sympathetic nervous system, and basically a signal coming from the hypothalamus telling it we are too hot or too cold. If we are too cold, that's when we vasoconstrict. If we are too hot, that's when we vasodilate. The vasoconstriction is a little more simple. Basically, we release norepinephrine onto the vessels of the skin, causing constriction. The vasodilation is still something that is a question that hasn't quite been answered. We don't know exactly what the main neurotransmitter is that causes vasodilation in the skin. The other mechanism that we just talked about that's in the skin that's going to help with dissipating heat is going to be sweat. All right, so we have sweat glands in the skin. We have two different types of sweat glands. We have the apocrine sweat glands, which are primarily in like the armpit, the palms of the hand, the groin, areas that we generally associate with the smellier sweat. And then we have the eccrine sweat glands, which are the sweat glands in most of the rest of the body. And so we're just going to talk about the eccrine sweat glands now, which is what's being shown here as these orange coils with a tube going all the way up to the surface of the skin, and then we have all these pores here that are going to release the sweat onto the surface of the skin. Again, these are eccrine sweat glands. This is what most of our body has, and this is what our body primarily uses when we're talking about sweat to reduce body temperature. And so how our body sweats, we're going to have, again, an increase in sympathetic nervous system. This time it's going to release acetylcholine, which is not typically what we talk about with the sympathetic nervous system, but in this case, sympathetic nervous system does release acetylcholine onto the sweat glands, and that's going to increase the sweat rate, causing more sweat to get onto the surface of the body so we can increase heat loss. And so I've mentioned before that we have these sensory neurons in the skin as well as in the core of the body sending a signal to the hypothalamus that would have been part of the signal to increase the sweat rate. Primarily our body is going to use the core signal, because if you think about the core is more important, that's where all the organs are, that's where the brain is, it's in the core of the body, not the periphery where the skin is. So the body is much more sensitive to core temperature changes than it is to skin temperature changes. So let's go ahead and stop right there. This was an overview on how our bodies deal with heat and cold. And so the next video in this three-part series on exercise in the heat and cold is going to be specifically on the hot part of things, so exercising in the heat. So if you have any questions on the current video, you can put those comments and questions below and I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, please come back and watch that next video. Thanks.